So without any more, it's my great pleasure to introduce a fellow member of the DSAI Steering Committee, and that is Mark Garavan. Now, Mark, I know, is a man of many parts and is known to you from many of your roles: local development, social care, and global development. So Mark lectures on applied social care in another of the new, if we like to say, technological universities, the Atlantic Technological University. He's author of a wonderful book that has been an inspiration to many of my colleagues, called Compassionate Activism, an Exploration of Integral Social Care. So already we're beginning to see the links. His PhD research was on Irish environmental activism, and I knew his name from FASTA, and he's also, in the spirit of local development, chairperson of his local Citizens Advice Bureau, and a community activist on the board of Westport Family Resource Centre, Mayo Travellers Support Group, and Mayo Intercultural Action. He's also chairperson of the Planet Youth Mayo Steering Committee, which I must say I haven't heard about, but he might allude to it now. And his main focus of research is on how to develop community-based responses to current ecological and social crises. So thank you for being with us here today, Mark. And if I can hand over to you now.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Thank you for that welcome. My first observation is the modesty of speaking to a technological university that just claims to Shannon as its catchment. I come from a far more arrogant and pretentious entity, which apparently is claiming the Atlantic as its remit, which is very alarming because that's a lot of countries and a huge amount of space. However, no doubt the marketing gurus earned a lot of money to come up with the symmetry of it. But I'm actually delighted to be here. I've been in Thurles before myself physically many years ago at a conference on sustainability education. I think Davy Phillips and others might have organised it with FASTA, so I feel a good connection with your campus. Can I ask you a horribly technical question? Am I to share a PowerPoint, or are you from your end sharing it? Do you want me to do it?
You can try share it, Mark, yourself if you want.
Okay, perfect. This is where one's technical skills become exposed very quickly. I should be okay at this. Here we go. So you should be able to see that, I hope.
We can, Mark.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, the theme, or what we're trying to do here, is understanding research and understanding how we research this issue of sustainability or sustainable development. So I'm going to try, I think, to start off by just being a little bit provocative. I'm not going to say anything particularly original. I think anything I say, people will have already been exposed to those sets of ideas, but I'll try and package it in a way that I hope produces a question, because I do know that Catherine, one original idea in terms of the two-day structure for the event was that day one might serve as a set of provocations or problem setting, and then day two might be a way of trying to respond to it and thinking about how we might respond to it. So sadly, I'm taking up the challenge of being a provocateur right at the beginning. And the question then is how we actually interrogate these core concepts that we're using, sustainability and sustainable development, and how we make sense of them, and how we attempt to understand them. So here is, oh, let me see, slides needs to move, there we go. The famous Austrian philosopher Wittgenstein, the limits of my language means the limits of my world. Now, this is a very well-known kind of phrase, and I've always been intrigued by this because this is about language and how important language is. So what we're trying to do in research, and what we're trying to do in, I suppose, any academic or intellectual activity, is to make sense of things. How do we understand something? And the problem for us is that the tools we have is just language. But the problem is our language limits us as much as it reveals something. And language can become very disconcerting. So I've just mentioned you know, the difference between claiming the Shannon versus the Atlantic. I mean, there's a linguistic claim straight away that kind of creates a whole set of conceptual associations for somebody in addressing a corporate entity. By the way, can I just pause for a second? I'm just getting so much feedback that I'm beginning to, I'm hearing my voice coming back. So maybe one thing people might do is mute if you're not speaking, if that's okay. Sorry now to just say that. It's just, I'm just getting a bit of noise coming back to me. Perfect. Thank you very much for that. There's a very good illustration of this, and I'm going to copy a story by Bruno Latour. And we're all familiar with that famous set-piece engagement between Galileo and the Inquisition, and how the Inquisition called in Galileo to get him to retract his claim that the Earth was moving around the sun. So we're all familiar with that, and we're familiar with the idea of the Inquisition being some kind of evil, malevolent entity, and Galileo being a hero for truth. And of course, there's a huge element of correctness in that. But what's interesting about it is not so much that the Inquisition may have been evil, as that they may simply have been prisoners of their own language. And within their conceptual framework, the Earth simply cannot be moving. It's simply impossible conceptually. So if someone says it, while they can understand the set of words, they don't understand the meaning of it, because it is clear to them that the Earth isn't moving. And Latour switches this to make a challenge to us, who we would obviously think of ourselves on the side of Galileo. But he said, imagine if we were to ask ourselves how we would respond to somebody who said to us that at this current moment of climate breakdown and ecological death, that the Earth is moved. The Earth is moved. We know the words, but do we understand it as a concept? What does it mean to say that the planet itself, Mother Earth, Gaia, is moved? Again, conceptually, for most Westerners educated within a kind of humanist anthropocentric framework, the concept of the Earth being a repository of any kind of subjectivity or emotional response is simply beyond our conceptual apparatus. It's beyond our language. So it's very hard for us to think of these terms. So therefore, if we're talking to people perhaps outside of our cultural framework who do think in these terms, it's very hard for us to really empathize or really gain entry into that perspective. We're trapped not by some malevolence on our part, but simply because of our linguistic framework, our linguistic apparatus. So we're so inherently caught up in anthropocentrism and ethnocentrism. It's very hard for us to step outside of that. So I think that's one thing I want to signal in terms of people doing research. For those of us who go in to do research with communities, the humility that we need is really quite profound. We need some mechanism to understand exactly how language is being used, and that can take us quite an amount of time. So I want to expand on that idea a little bit. So I'll just go through a few ideas, and I want to use a little case study very, very briefly. My intention is to stop talking at about 10:30 so that we have a 15-minute period for questions or comments or debate, or if there's none of that happening, at least we have 15 minutes of silence, and that just gives you a break, which is no harm. So I don't propose to speak beyond 10:30, if that's okay. Okay, backwards. So if we take these two key concepts that we're using, and they've been mentioned a few times already this morning, sustainability and development, I mean, as everybody knows, these are very contested terms. And one of the things that can happen when language leads us astray is that we quickly become trapped by metaphors. So development is such a loaded metaphor because development always implies growth, and growth always implies progress. And so you have this stepping stone effect. And so development looks like you're moving from one state that's inferior to another state that's superior. So once we claim ourselves to be on the side of development, it's not just a neutral claim. We're making a claim that we're on the side of progress. We're on the side of bringing things from a worse state to a better state. And sustainability, of course, is become a word so utilized now, it's very hard to know at all what it means, because it could just mean something happening continually. So you can have sustainable growth, just means growth is ongoing and continuing. Or could it mean growth within limits? These are two completely different meanings of sustainability. So they're used in different ways by different speakers. So if we were to ask the history of the United States, I mean, is the United States a developed country? You see, that's while we understand what that question means, it's hard to answer it. It depends what we mean by developed. So I mean, if we were to use metrics of industrialization, production of things, consumerism, blah, 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 technology, yes, in that sense, it's developed. If we were to speak perhaps with indigenous communities across the American continent and ask them, is America developed? They might have a different view. They might see that the last few centuries of the American narrative is in fact a hiatus or an interruption of development or an intervention in a cultural sustainable continuity that has spanned millennia, and that we're looking at a kind of a aberration in the historical narrative spread over a few centuries, which will, by virtue of its current trajectory, not continue on, but actually begin to implode upon itself and disintegrate, and that there may well be a return to that more longer-term narrative, which actually constitutes the development of the Americas. Again, it's a contested question. Now, the point is, for those people here who are students and trying to do research, it's so critical to be alert to these nuances and these differences and these contestations, and to acknowledge that we don't come from a position of neutrality, that we've got to be very clear about how we are using words and what we mean by those words, and also how they sound to the people that we are engaging with. I keep going backwards, my technical skills. So let's look at the mainstream idea, the United Nations Development Goals, which again have been referenced this morning. And of course, they're very important and they're very laudable and they do give a direction. But once again, they're not always obvious in terms of their value or their utility. And maybe of all the goals, you know, goal 8 is perhaps, in terms of the literature at least, one of the more controversial ones. And if you look at it here, you can see it promotes, again, we're back to sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth. Now here sustained is used in two different ways. A sustained growth means one that continues, but then we have sustainable, which may mean within limits, but it may also mean just continuing. And we also have a claim to economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Now, when you think about this goal, it's actually highly ideological. And in fact, it's open to multiple meanings. Because at one level, it's a green light for industrialization, it's a green light to consumer capitalism, because you could imagine productive employment here is understood to be integration within the current market. Economic growth is still permitted, and globally, we simply cannot do economic growth. That's not possible. The global south may have an ethical claim for economic growth on the grounds of equality and equality of access to resources, but the global whole cannot literally do any more economic growth. And yet this is something we never address. So I say this against ourselves in the technological universities, which laud ourselves as being agents of potential growth. We cannot continue to do growth in a world disintegrating ecologically. It's degrowth that is now the essential for the future. Globally, though, we may permit some growth, of course. So again, I'm not going to go into this. There are people here far more expert in this particular debate than I am. But you can see here again, the meanings of things contained in language are not obvious. And if you do think they're obvious, then you're simply not alert to the subtleties and the nuances of the language itself. In fact, I really love this particular symbol here because you can see the banner underneath the sustainability goals, 17 goals to transform our world. And it's a movement from left to right, which is the way Westerners would read. And it ends with an arrow on the right-hand side, again, summoning up this metaphor of progress. We're transforming our world. And again, you get the subtle coding of this meaning. This means progress and transformation and the movement to the better, which of course at one level is true, but again, what constitutes the good life? This is why we do want indeed to be familiar with Greek mythology, to see a culture that actually grappled with what it is to live the good life and what that means. I got it right this time. Sustainable development. So, is it good? Is it bad? Thumbs up or thumbs down? What does it mean? Who decides? How do we measure it? All of this kind of thing. So these are the sets of key conceptual questions that we have to begin to think about if we're going to be or adopt a kind of critical perspective on sustainable development. And by critical, I don't mean negative. I just mean that ask questions about it so that if it is a robust concept, it can stand on its two legs. It makes sense when we use that term. key to this, of course, is not just what does it mean, who decides what it means? And that's a question that I just want to go into for about 10 minutes. Who decides? And this is why I wanted to use as a theme for this opening talk the notion of researching communities, or researching local lives, or researching local people who are either the recipients of developmental projects or the victims of it or the beneficiaries of it. Who decides, and how do we measure all of this? We live in a world, and especially in an academic world, obsessed with measurement and the metrics of measurement. In fact, we often think evidence, academic evidence or research evidence, is itself the product of some form of metrics. If you can't measure it, then you can't make a value claim about something. You have to be able to quantify and demonstrate. And our entire intellectual culture is utterly dominated by this type of a paradigm, a quantification paradigm, that finds it almost impossible to value something outside of some mode of metric, some measurement, which has to be objective, therefore demonstrable to others. And that itself is an intellectual language claim. So let's do a little thought experiment, which is, when you see water, what is it you actually see? Or when you see soil or earth or trees or air, what do you see? And often, now at the risk here of simplification and creating a straw man, so I don't want to do that, but nonetheless, within the evidential imperative of science, when we see things, we see objects. We see things other than ourselves. We see things out there in a physical world. They're objects. They're things that human beings can work on or relate to. We are subjects and they're all objects. What about if water, soil, and earth was also a subject? Itself is subjectivity. And some contemporary theories in the social sciences, you know, we've talked now about post-materialisms and post-humanisms and new types of modes of thinking, are attempts to get beyond this subject-object division that is so characteristic again of Western thinking, and begin to recognize a subjectivity to all the elements of the living planet, and that water has desires in that sense. Water wants to do things. It wants to flow in particular places. We just don't let it do that because it would affect us. So in an anthropocentric world, we dam water or marshal water or manage water. We do the same with soil and so on. And we can measure water in terms of its quality and the nutrients and the fish and so on. But this question remains a provocation. When you see water, what do you see? So let me just explore what I mean by that a bit more. I did an interview with an Indigenous lady from North America, Chas Jewett, and she was what she called a water protector. So people are familiar with the Dakota pipeline protest some years ago in the United States. And it involved a huge mobilization of Indigenous people to protect waterways. And from the developer's point of view, the development was completely safe. It was a pipeline. It was never going to leak. There was nothing going to happen to it. It was merely an engineering project going from A to B. But it went through particular lands that were regarded as sacred to particular Indigenous communities and past waterways that they wanted to protect. And during the protest mobilization, Chas Jewett was telling me that when the Indigenous communities gathered to defend the waterways, it initiated for them a huge re-engagement with their own cultural perspectives in a way that they hadn't expected. And in particular, this question of water and the notion of water as a relative. Water as a relative, not as an object to be managed for human benefit, but as a subjectivity to be related to. And these are just some basic quotes from my discussion or my dialogue with Chas Jewett that was published some years ago. Water is in our body. We were born in water. We are water beings. Water is a sacrament. Now you see, this is the kind of language that Western science probably is not, I mean, it can understand the words, but the sentiment, the sensitivity behind it is probably still quite alien to us. We are water beings. And then she talked about at camp, every morning they did a water ceremony, which was offering tobacco to the water. Again, that's a non-utilitarian action from our point of view. It doesn't have any particular effect. Why would you do that? But again, from within this indigenous perspective, it made perfect sense. It was an offering to the water. They were there water protecting, so they would invoke the water as a co-activist with them. And she talked then about, if you think, and she was quite strong, if you think your perspective is superior, look at your waters. If you think this is progress, look at our waters 5 centuries ago. Look at your waters today. There's an empirical measure. So now that's a metric, isn't it, for what is development? Is there any water in Ireland where anyone here would lean over and drink straight from the brook? Probably not. Is there a single lake people will go in, dip a cup and drink the water straight from it? Any lake in Ireland? Any? No, probably not. So all our waters are polluted is not a piece of verbosity. It's probably empirically true. The waters are dying all over. And then this, she says, is linked to indigenous people who are dying as well, because in her idea, indigenous people are very closely connected to the subjectivities of other non-human or other than human life forms around them, and that these are the one thing in a kind of continuity. Go forward. Now, we think indigenous, and that kind of evokes a whole kind of sense of otherness and so on and so forth. But let's not be so quick about that either. So the case study I want to mention was the dispute that occurred in North Mayo. It's now some many years ago, starting in about 1999, reached its high point in about 2005 and began to peter out and end by about 2008. Now, I was involved in that right from the start. I researched it as part of research I was doing, and I became involved in the campaign a little bit as a spokesperson. So I'm familiar with the dynamics of this campaign. So again, let's just ask that question. When you see somewhere, what do you see? Now, so here's 2 contrasting ways of seeing a place. So on the right-hand side, you have a map. Of course, it's a map. And nowadays, indeed, it's probably our Google map and that strange female voice that tells us where to go and so on and so forth that we blindly obey, and it orientates us across landscape. I had the privilege of walking along the North Mayo coastline with a local man, Unshin McCrath, who's a native Irish speaker. He learned English at the age of 6 once he went to school. And he was walking me across a number of fields and mentioning or invoking the place names as he did so. And I realized he was walking across a landscape that for him was entirely animate. This wasn't physical space. This was a landscape that by virtue of the names, the accumulation of names, was constantly speaking to him. And these names were both recent. They could invoke something that happened 10 years ago, all the way back to deep mythology, back to our friends, even contemporaneous with the ancient Greeks of 3,000 years ago, pre-Celtic names. And there are lots of those kind of names on that Mayo coastline. And so this man was walking on a landscape that for him was speaking to him. Now, he was not an indigenous man, as we would understand that term. He's a white European, but he was an Irish language native speaker in a landscape that he had grown up in, and critically, with the place names that he knew. And I've just given you some examples of them there. I'm not going to read them out. We don't have time. But it was an extraordinary experience. And I realized that for many of these people in this North Mayo Gaeltacht community, when they talk about place, they mean something completely different from physical spatial coordinates. So again, the question is, if we were to measure how you would develop that place, whose metric would we use? What would be our metric? Would we indeed use the sustainability goals once we have employment and et cetera, that would be development? Or is something completely different going on here? So here's a quote, and it's a long quote. That's why in this case, I'm happy to use a PowerPoint. Willie Corduff was one of the local people who ended up in prison during 2005, what group of people that came to be known in media shorthand, the Rossport Five. He was a farmer. And I did a short book with the Rossport Five in about 2007, and I had a tape recorder, and I was talking to Willie. I knew him quite well, and I had the recorder on so that he was not aware of it, or he'd ignored it. We were just talking away, and then I suddenly turned to him and I just said, look, tell me this, why are you actually against this project? why are you opposing the development of a gas proposal in North Mayo that would bring development and employment? And this is verbatim his answer. So, I mean, again, I'll read it only for the sake of economy of time. I was born and reared on this farm. It's memories that are making us do what we are doing. My father came here in 1947. The place then was pure bog with a fallen down house. The memories we have are of the way we were brought up, hard times. They're the memories you have and the memories you have to keep. To see someone coming in now and trying to destroy it, as Shell is doing, it kills you. Our footsteps are around the place since we were able to walk. There are memories of our fathers and mothers and how hard they worked to bring us up. This was all bogland and all had to be reclaimed by hand. Doing corners, my spade, and shaking a bit of their own seed that the cows had left after them in the shed. It wasn't that they went out and bought seed, for they couldn't afford to go out and buy seed. They gathered up the seed that was left after the cow had eaten. They shook it in a corner every year to make it green. That's the reality. It's all memories. You cannot let them die. Now, whatever one thinks about this in terms of its validity, it's an extraordinary answer. Because here is a man indigenous to this community whose rationale for taking a political position has nothing to do with any category of politics we're familiar with. This has nothing to do with anti-capitalism, anti-oil companies. This is a man grounded in his place and essentially invoking memories. In other words, that the intrusion into his land of a huge pipeline in some way would breach the continuity of memories and breach the integrity of the connection between people and place. And that breach was something he could not stomach it. Now, the thing is, if you took this man and put him on prime time and had him in a debate and asked him why he was against, and he said something like this, probably not many people would fully understand it, and he probably wouldn't do it anyway, because it would seem a bit quaint and a bit naive and a bit rural and a bit primitive. So, when we come to the public language around something like the Corrib gas dispute, you get a much more diffuse set of languages, and it all depends on who people are talking to. So if you think of Willie Corduff as actually the hidden truth of people's motivations, but you won't hear that language anywhere. So in other words, when the local community and me indeed as a spokesperson was trying to talk about what this dispute was about, we would have to switch our language constantly to make it relevant to the interlocutor we were engaged with. So the local authority didn't care about memories, it cared about land use. Bord Pleanála didn't care about people and place, it cared about just land use. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Association, it didn't care about that, it cared about pollution control. Would there be pollution? The Health and Safety Authority, that was interested in industrial safety. The state just wanted development. Shell obviously wanted to have profit and growth, and it claimed it wanted consultation, by which it meant here's the project and now we're going to explain it to you, and if you have any concerns about it, it's just because you don't understand it and we've made a bad job of explaining it, so we'll explain it again and we'll do it a bit better. The local publics, in other words communities outside the immediate area, they were concerned about health and safety. The wider publics, activists, they were concerned about natural resources, and you heard all of those as linked with the debate. Maybe it was about the sell-off of natural resources, could have been about environmentalism, could have been about anti-globalization, anti-oil and gas companies, and so on. And so that's what motivated those people. The media just wanted novelty and attention. So if there was rows or trouble or protests or guards, that was exactly what it was interested in. Academics like me came there to study it from a social movement theory point of view, or whatever was our prevailing theory. And so we would read what was going on from the perspective of the theoretical lens that we brought to bear. So there's a warning now for all of you who are researchers. All of us, myself included, we start off doing research, we set it out, we have our own theory, and then we go and find that theory in the empirical reality we are looking at. And we read it from within that perspective. I was at a meeting in the local community well into the dispute, and there were lots of visitors there, as it tended to happen, and there were a couple of people who had come down from Dublin, and after the meeting had begun and there was a lot of talk and so on, one of them stood up and said, what's missing here from the start has been the absence of a class analysis. And he proceeded to give a class analysis of the whole dispute, to the utter befuddlement of virtually every single local person there, who probably never in their lives woke up in the morning thinking about class analysis to deal with anything. But it made sense to that activist. And no doubt he could have written an absolutely brilliant essay fully explaining and indeed making sense of the whole thing in terms of a classic class analysis. Whether that actually motivates anybody is a different question. So what I would say is, as a kind of thing to keep in mind as researchers and as academics, is we have to be very careful when we isolate what a local community's view is, or even whether a local community has a single view about anything, or whether we can even essentialize something called the local view or a local community. Rhetoric is the thing we forget. So we're back now to our friends in ancient Greece again, who recognized the importance of rhetoric. Rhetoric is misunderstood in our use of the word today. Rhetoric just means, how do I help someone else to understand what I am saying? That's what it means. How do I help you to understand what I am saying? And for me, therefore, to use rhetoric means I have to translate my concerns into terms that you can understand. So if I'm speaking to a development agency, I may have to use the language of development because that's the language it understands. Or if I'm speaking to a pollution control agency, I may have to speak about pollution control because that's the language it understands. It's a rhetorical calculation. If I keep speaking my language, no one will understand me and will pay heed to me. If I keep speaking about, if I try and argue about the environmental crisis today and say the trees are mourning, the waters are sad, the earth is moved, don't you get it? Hardly anyone in the West will understand that sensibility. They'll understand the words, but they won't understand the meaning of what I'm saying. So I won't make a rhetorical connection. So because rhetoric is always in play, as researchers, you have to be so cautious when you listen to people. And this is why I think the notion of dialogue is so central. So, question then, how do we actually go about researching local perspectives? And I'm going to end now with this. And this is something to explore. The notion of what I will call dialogic research, and this is not anything unique. There's nothing novel about it. I'm making no claim here to have discovered something, far from it. This is merely a way just to describe already existing and well understood methodologies. So this is not at all something new. This is just more an ethic by which we can approach research and approach the question of really establishing sustainability. To go back to my opening question, how do we determine the metrics by which we measure something? And one of those is, how does a local community receive this idea? Is it development as it understands it? So I just want to emphasize here a couple of things, and then I will stop because I'm now 5 minutes over what I said I would give myself. In dialogic research, so here's a few things. One is the notion of empathic listening. I don't like the idea of detached listening. I mean, we back to the Earth sustainability, we cannot be neutral on these things. So we have to have empathy for local people and their attempts to live viable and sustainable lives. So there has to be empathy. Again, it's actually a rhetorical consideration for people. If people don't feel that you have their best interests at heart, they actually don't communicate with you very well. That relational connection is breached, and then you're merely another object extracting data from them. So empathic listening is quite important. And then over a prolonged time period, time is a hugely important variable, which we sometimes forget in doing research or trying to unravel things. We need time. It's not enough to interview somebody and then leave them, because people don't come with pre-ordered views like that. I mean, if we go back to social care, which Catherine mentioned, and I know a little bit about as well, we don't expect, if you go into some kind of therapeutic interaction with somebody, that in meeting one, they're going to tell you everything that's gone wrong for them. It's not that they're holding it back. They may not know themselves. They need time in talking to somebody to excavate their language around their experiences. They don't just have language ready to go and they're just waiting for someone to ask them and then they can deliver perfect paragraphs. They don't have that. They have to figure things out in the interaction with somebody. Oh, that's an interesting question. I didn't think of it like that. This allows me to think new thoughts about something. That kind of thing. Or someone else says something and that stimulates something in my mind. So you need this listening plus time, prolonged time, in a variety of settings, so that people are both formal and informal, so that local meanings and language can unravel slowly. Because meanings emerge not fully formed out of the rational actor's head, but through social interaction. Because again, a Western conceit is that we're rational actors, and that means, by the way, what rational tends to mean is that we always know what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. That's an assumption of Western thinking, that there's always a reason why someone is doing something. Well, sometimes it's hard to give reasons why we do something. So, I mean, we don't go for walks anymore. We go walking for exercise. We go walking for fresh air. We have to justify human activities against standards or metrics of rationality. But often that's not actually the way people are. Meanings emerge from the way we socially interact. So we have to unravel ideas from people in a dialogic exchange over time, because the academic researcher themselves is going to interfere with the answer. So if I come with a particular perspective, I'm looking for that perspective in the people I work with. So again, back to my poor old friend Wittgenstein, we're really all the time trying to overcome the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. My God, we live in a world of constant argument, and everyone is screaming at each other all the time now, and we can argue about anything. We are, after all, social primates, and we love making noise and we love disputing. And at this point, we're now got the technology to allow us to dispute and argue over absolutely everything. And so we are befuddled by a surplus of words, but a deficit of meaning. We're saying too much, but meaning less all the time, in an exact parallel with the decaying ecology, because there's a diminishment of subjectivity as we stop paying attention to other than human life forms as subjects, and as we ourselves become more and more objectified into identity categories and discursive positions as we scream and shout at each other. So the researcher has to navigate a way through all of this, and for what is worth, I'm suggesting this notion of dialogic research might be one particular way to do it, with the various variables that I mentioned there. Okay, I do apologize. I think I'm ended the PowerPoint there. I hope it's no longer visible, and that it's just back to me. Is that right? I hope it is. I didn't realize that the sun was beaming in on me there, so giving me a kind of a angelic hue, maybe. So only 5 minutes. I've sadly over-talked, as can happen. So my apologies for that. But even if we 5 minutes of silence, I think that would be good and soothing. So thank you very much.
Mark, thank you so much. That was a wonderful, wonderful start indeed. And I'm sure for the next 5 minutes, some people would like to comment. So please feel free. Nita.
Thanks, Mark. That was an excellent start to what I would have imagined this to be. I had a couple of points, and thank you for. I kind of probably very bold and needed. I had a quotation from Eileen Moulton Robinson, who's an Indigenous Australian feminist. And I want to read out her quote, which I put in the chat. She says, there is an inextricable link between a nation state's sovereignty and what counts as knowledge, where and when it is produced, and by whom. And she's critiquing feminist standpoint theories, which is what I also work on. For example, all the universities in the USA and Canada where feminist standpoint theorists produce knowledge are built on Indigenous people's lands. But that question is not raised. This racialized and gendered form of sovereignty, which she has argued elsewhere as being patriarchal and white, underpins and legitimizes the existence of these universities and their everyday activities through its regulatory mechanisms and government and law. So even feminism runs short unless there are other voices which have not been heard before, is questioning this. And you're very right on that. There's a quotation which I also want to read from the previous chair of DSAI, Pauric Carmody's book on development theory and practice in a changing world, where he has quietly questioned the SDGs very, very beautifully, actually. He says, on page 78, interestingly, however, the SDGs are more overt in their promotion of the market, with goal 17 calling for countries to adopt and implement investment promotion regimes for the less developed countries to promote foreign investment. Likewise, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda for Financing for Development, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly and fed into the SDGs, said, or it reads this, International trade is an engine for inclusive economic growth and poverty reduction and contributes to the promotion of sustainable development. We will continue to promote a universal rules-based, open, transparent, predictable, inclusive, non-discriminatory, and equitable multilateral trading system under the WTO, as well as meaningful trade liberalization. So it's all there. It's the SDG goals are quite contradictory to each other, in fact, and that was very beautifully brought out by you. And this is something we need to kind of focus on, because we are a platform where we can facilitate these kind of conversations and lead. I mean, I'm glad DSAI is going to lead this, a constructive criticism is what. So thank you again, Mark.
Yep.